There's beauty in simplicity. Less is more. We're going to talk about some composers who took this idea and ran with it as far as they could. Arguably, the father of this in music is a gentleman named Erik Satie. He was born in 1866 in France. His father was a music publisher. At the age of 13, he enters the conservatory, and he hates it. He refers to it as a vast, uncomfortable building, a jail. He had a difficult time at the conservatory. In fact, he remarked at one point that his harmony professor said that he would probably make a good piano professor, and his piano professor said he probably had a good gift for composition. Satie later joined the Rosicrucians, which is a sort of small, weird religious sect that dates all the way back to the Middle Ages. It's suspected that part of his involvement with the Rosicrucian sect is what got him interested in exploring older musics, and this helped him get away from major and minor tonalities and explore more of what are known as the ancient Greek modes. When he was grown, Satie supported himself as a piano player at a local bar called the Black Cat in Paris. At the age of 24, he meets Claude Debussy, and it's during that time, when Debussy was 28, that Satie comes up with his quote about French needing their own music without sauerkraut, and inspires Debussy to work on Pelléas et Mélisande, his big impressionist opera. Of course, when he sees the finished score and hears how it turns out, he comes to the realization that Impressionism is clearly the wrong way to go. At the age of 40, he goes back to school to study counterpoint, feeling that his own musical knowledge is inadequate. Satie was a radical socialist with a very sharp wit. A lonely man, he had only one known affair in his life. It was a very difficult one with a woman who was a famous model, painter, and trapeze artist. It is hard to say whether the affair itself or the ending of it caused more pain for Satie. In a letter to his brother, he wrote, "I shall have great difficulty in regaining possession of myself, loving this little person as I have loved her. She was able to take all of me. Time will do what at this moment I cannot." Some say that Satie's humor was essentially the bitterness of a man who felt the need to disguise his serious work in order to make sure that it couldn't be criticized, and just pass it all off as a joke. Satie was a vocal critic of music critics. He went so far as to found his own church, the Metropolitan Church of Art of Jesus, of which he was the only member. He wouldn't just disagree with music critics, he'd excommunicate them. Satie was known for witty quotes like, "Young men, stay out of the cafes. Take it from someone who's spent much time in them and doesn't regret it." Satie dedicated his life to music and poverty. He lived in a small single room, which he never allowed anyone to see. At his death in 1925, his room was discovered to be almost completely bare, with just a bed, a chair, a cupboard containing 12 velvet suits, and a raggedy jury-rigged piano which barely worked. Despite the fact, or perhaps because of the fact his father was a music publisher, Satie handed over his works to music publishers for ridiculously low sums, didn't make very much money off of anything he wrote. Musically, Satie is known as the apostle of simplicity. He hated pretension and the sauce, as he called it, of Debussy's Impressionism. He didn't want the big symphonies of Beethoven or these giant Wagnerian dramas. He sought simplicity in his music above all else. For Satie, melody was king. He believed music should be devoid of personal expression and that a piece's beauty should come from its inherent simplicity and construction. Aside from simplicity, Satie brought humor to music. In fact, one person, Virgil Thompson, wrote that perhaps Satie's greatest gift to the 20th century was realizing that music shouldn't take itself so seriously. Satie gave beautiful, tranquil piano pieces titles like Pieces in the Shape of a Pear, or Melodies to Make One Flee, or Sketches and Annoyances of a Wooden Man. Whereas the Impressionists had included instructions in their pieces for performers to play things delicately, like the wings of a butterfly, Satie put notes in his pieces for people to play things like a nightingale with a toothache. He also wrote with no bar lines and no time signatures, which was extraordinarily revolutionary at the time. Another one of his innovations was the idea of furniture music. Satie wrote that we should develop a music designed for restaurants or like furniture that would be useful for people and sit in the background. This furniture music would mask the clanking of knives and forks and plates at the dinner table and fill awkward gaps in conversation without intruding upon what people were saying. In essence, it was music that was just supposed to be there, but not necessarily be listened to. Satie wrote a piece called Vexations, and this piece alone is enough to guarantee his place in music history. Written while he was in the middle of his love affair, it's perhaps his strangest piece and one of the most mysterious of the 20th century. If played as indicated, the entire score of the piece lasts 1 minute. But Satie wrote these following performance instructions on the sheet music. To play this motif 840 times in succession, it would be advisable to prepare oneself beforehand in the deepest silence by serious immobilities. If you play it 840 times, the piece lasts 14 hours. You can also interpret his tempo markings to be half as fast, in which case the piece lasts 28 hours. This instruction has actually been taken seriously by several worldwide piano players. Many performances have been made, but perhaps they're all missing the point. After all, Satie doesn't say you have to play it 840 times. He just says to play it 840 times. Of course, we'll never know his true intentions because the piece wasn't published during his lifetime. It was discovered after his death. The piece is incredibly challenging and difficult. Not only is the actual writing of it very difficult to read, but it's crammed with accidentals, odd notes, and funny rhythms. Performers have to really dig to find the music in this thing. And even after repeating it over and over and over again, each time they pass through the score, it's still challenging and difficult. The piece requires intense concentration, and your previous experience is of little value, which is probably in keeping with Satie's ideas. He looked at experience as sort of a waste of time. The piece is also something of a musical maze. You have to really concentrate to navigate through it. Now remember, Satie was a Rosicrucian, and to the Rosicrucians, the maze was a familiar ancient medieval metaphor for a spiritual journey. At the same time, the notation is a giant joke. Satie was no doubt laughing his head off as he wrote this mess down. The piece was attempted in Australia in 1970 by a Mr. Peter Evans. After 16 hours, he reached repetition 595, stopped abruptly, and left the piano. He claimed as he was playing, his mind became full of evil thoughts. He said, animals and other things started peering out of the score at him. In his own words, I would not play the piece again. I felt each repetition slowly wearing my mind away. I had to stop. People who play it do so at their own great peril. Another music writer argues that what Satie is really doing is creating a poor man's ring cycle. After all, if you play this piece for 14 hours, it's about as long as Wagner's masterwork. Either way, for Vexations repetition, for humor in music, for the idea of furniture music, and simplicity, Erik Satie will be remembered as one of the greatest composers of the 20th century.